In the summer of 1988, the worst drought in 40 years burned through South Texas like something with intention. The grass turned the color of old paper by June. The stock tanks dropped 2 feet, then 4. The cattle stood at empty water troughs in the middle of the afternoon, with their heads low and their ears back, and the sound that came off the land was the sound of nothing, which is the loudest sound a rancher can hear. On a morning in early August of that year, a man named Vernon Holt was driving his pickup truck back from the feed store in Carrizo Springs. Vernon was 61 years old. He ran 640 acres in Zavala County and had been running cattle on that land since his father handed it to him in 1967. He knew every road in the county the way a man knows the layout of his own house, which is to say, without thinking about it, the body just knowing where to go. He was driving the county road that ran along the south fence line of the Vance Ranch, a road he had driven probably 5,000 times in his adult life. He had driven it in the rain. He had driven it in the dark. He had driven it the morning after Roy Vance's funeral in February of 1980. And he had driven it every week since, without once slowing down. But on this particular morning in August of 1988, Vernon Holt slowed down. He slowed down because what he saw on the other side of the fence did not make sense. The pasture was green, not the green of a well-watered lawn, not the deep, saturated green of a Gulf Coast ranch after a good rain, but green, real green, living green. The grass was 6 inches tall with seed heads on it. There was color in that pasture that had no business being there in August of 1988, when every other pasture in Zavala County looked like the surface of a dried creek bed. Vernon pulled his truck to the shoulder of the road and cut the engine. He sat there for a moment, looking through the windshield. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the morning heat, which was already building towards something brutal, and he walked to the fence line and stood there. The trees were 30 feet tall by then, eucalyptus trees with long sickle-shaped leaves that caught the light in a particular silver-green way and moved in the dry breeze with a sound that was different from the sound of oak or mesquite, different from any sound Vernon had heard in a South Texas pasture. They were spaced across the land in an irregular pattern, not in rows, but scattered like something natural, like something that had always been there, and each one cast a broken circle of shade across the ground beneath it. Clara Vance's Brangus cattle were in that shade, 40 of them, maybe more, standing easy, ears forward, tails swishing at flies in no particular hurry. They were grazing in the cool underneath those trees, as though it were any morning in any year, as though the land around them for 40 miles in every direction was not cracking and burning and dying in the worst drought since Eisenhower was in the White House. Vernon Holt stood at that fence for a long time. He looked at the trees. He looked at the grass. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the ground under the trees, which was darker than the ground in the open, which held moisture. You could see moisture that had no right to be there in August of that year. He looked at his own forearm, which was already running sweat in the 8 o'clock heat, and he looked at those cattle standing in that cool, broken shade, and something happened behind his eyes that he was not going to talk about later, and that he was not going to think about too hard right now. He had said she was grieving. He had sat at the corner table of the Dairy Queen in Carrizo Springs in the spring of 1982. And he had told Ray Dutton and Carl Wicker and old Harlan Forbes exactly what he thought. She is grieving. That is all this is. Frank would never have done this. And the widow has gone and lost her mind, and by fall it will be a train wreck out there on the Vance Ranch. Those trees will be dead, and the county will pick up the pieces the way the county always picks up the pieces when a widow makes a decision she should not have made. He had been very certain when he said it. He was 61 years old, standing at a fence line in August of 1988, and he was looking at the most certain he had ever been about anything, and the most wrong. Vernon stood at that fence for the better part of an hour. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. She was standing at the sink with a coffee cup in her hand, and she saw his truck on the shoulder, and she saw him at the fence, and she did not go out to meet him. After a while, he got back in his truck. He did not look toward the house. He started the engine and drove away, and the sound of his tires on the county road faded into the heat. And then there was nothing but the wind in the eucalyptus leaves and the soft movement of cattle in the shade. That is where the story ends. Now let me take you back 6 years to where it begins. It also left his wife, Clara, with 340 acres of South Texas rangeland, a herd of Brangus cattle, an Alice Chalmers tractor from 1963, a Ford pickup, $18,000 in a savings account, and a notebook in the kitchen drawer that she had not opened in 12 years. Clara was 37 years old when Roy died. She had no children. Her mother had passed in 1976. Her father, Eldon Voss, was living in a small house in San Antonio and was not well. There was Roy's older brother, Boyd, who drove out to the ranch every week whether she asked him to or not, who had his own 800 acres east of La Prairie, and who treated the Vance Ranch with the particular possessiveness of a man who had always believed somewhere underneath everything that the land was as much his to look after as it was anyone's. Clara spent 1980 running the ranch the way Roy had run it. She spent 1981 doing something else entirely. She spent 1981 in libraries. She drove to the Texas A&M Extension Office in Uvalde and asked the librarian for everything they had on agroforestry. She filed interlibrary loan requests for research papers from South America and Spain. She drove to the main library in San Antonio 3 times to sit in the periodicals room with papers spread across a reading table, taking notes in a composition notebook, with the focused patience of a woman who is not doing research as a hobby. She is doing research because she already knows what she is going to build, and she needs to know exactly how to build it right. To understand why, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a summer in 1961, when a 19-year-old girl named Clara Voss stepped off a propeller plane in Buenos Aires, Argentina, with her father Eldon and a composition notebook she had bought at a pharmacy in San Antonio the week before. Hollis had spent the previous decade experimenting with something he had read about in agricultural papers from Spain and Australia. He was planting trees in his cattle pastures, not along the fence lines, not in windbreaks at the edges of his fields, in the pastures themselves, scattered across the grass at irregular intervals the way a forest begins before it knows it is a forest. He had planted eucalyptus primarily. Eucalyptus camaldulensis, the river red gum native to Australia, a tree that in the right soil could grow 20 feet in 4 years, and would drop a leaf litter that broke down into the soil, rather than acidifying it, that would pull moisture from deep in the subsoil and deposit it on the surface through the root network that would cast a broken canopy shade across grass that in the brutal summer heat of northern Argentina was being cooked alive. Clara and her father spent 3 summers at Hollis's ranch, 3 summers between 1961 and 1963. And in those summers, Clara learned things that she wrote down in a composition notebook that she brought back to Texas in August of 1963 and put in a drawer. What she learned was this. In 1958, a drought hit the Corrientes province. It was not the worst drought in the history of the region, but it was serious. It lasted through most of the summer and into the fall. And when it was over, Ranchers across 4 surrounding counties had lost between 30 and 40% of their herds. They had sold cattle early at terrible prices. They had hauled water. They had watched grass they had spent years building go brown and brittle and then disappear. Gareth Hollis lost 6%. 6% of his herd in a drought that took a third of everyone else's. His grass under the canopy of trees that were then 7 years old had retained moisture that the open pastures had burned away. The shade had kept the soil temperature low enough that the grass roots survived the worst weeks. The cattle had been able to move between grazing and shade and water on their own schedule, burning less energy, losing less weight, drinking less. The leaf litter had kept feeding the soil biology when the rain stopped. The taproots of the eucalyptus had been pulling water from 30 feet underground and releasing it through the surface root system into the pasture soil. The trees had been an insurance policy. That was the phrase Gareth Hollis used. He said it to Clara on a September afternoon in 1961, standing at the edge of his south pasture, with the river visible in the distance, and the eucalyptus throwing their long, late afternoon shadows across the grass. He said, "Trees in a pasture are an insurance policy against the years when everything else fails." Clara wrote it down. She underlined it twice. When she came back to Texas in August of 1963 and asked her father why nobody did this in South Texas, he looked at her with the expression of a man who has thought about this question and arrived at an answer he does not entirely enjoy. "Texas ranchers don't plant trees," he said. "They clear trees. It is a cultural thing. You could show them the numbers, and they would still call you crazy. Some things a man believes with his spine, not his head." Clara put the notebook in a drawer. She married Roy Vance 2 years later in 1965. Roy had inherited the ranch from his father. Good land, good grass. No trees except the ones along the creek bottoms. Clara showed Roy the notebook once in 1968. He read it carefully and handed it back and said that if he planted trees in the pasture, his brother Boyd would never speak to him again. He did not say it as a joke. Clara put the notebook back in the drawer. She did not take it out again for 12 years. Roy died in February of 1980, and the notebook was still in the drawer when Clara went to the kitchen the morning after the funeral and made coffee for the people who had come to sit with her. She saw the drawer from across the room. She did not open it that morning, but she knew what was in it. She had always known what was in it. 8 months after Roy died in October of 1980, Clara made a drive she told nobody about. She told Boyd she was going to San Antonio to see her father. She was going to San Antonio, but she was not going only to San Antonio. She drove south from the city on Highway 281 to Kingsville, where the King Ranch maintained a research station that employed some of the best livestock and range scientists in the state. She had called ahead. She had made an appointment with a man named Dr. Wallace Pruitt, a range ecologist who had spent 12 years working on pasture systems in South America and the southern United States. She arrived at his office at 9 in the morning, and she did not leave until 3 in the afternoon. She put Eldon's composition notebook on his desk. She put the records Gareth Hollis had kept through the drought of 1958 on his desk. She put her own ranch's soil survey on his desk, her rainfall records from the previous 10 years, her cattle weight records by year, her pasture layout maps. She showed him everything. Dr. Pruitt spent the first 2 hours asking her questions. Specific questions, the kind a man asks when he is genuinely interested rather than politely interested. He asked about the spacing Hollis had used. He asked about the soil type at the Corrientes Ranch. He asked about Clara's cattle breeds and her current grass composition and the elevation of her water tables in dry years. Then he told her three things. The soil on the Vance Ranch was clay loam over sandy subsoil, slightly alkaline with good drainage. It was within a reasonable margin of the soil type at the Hollis operation in Corrientes. The rainfall was lower, 28 inches a year instead of 42, but it was consistent enough in its seasonal distribution that trees planted in late March after the spring rains would have time to establish root systems before the summer heat arrived. The species she needed was Eucalyptus camaldulensis, river red gum. It could tolerate the drought cycles of South Texas. It would grow fast enough to provide meaningful shade within 4 to 5 years. And it dropped a leaf litter that improved the soil rather than killing it. Then Dr. Pruitt said, there is one man in Texas who has been propagating Eucalyptus camaldulensis for the better part of 15 years. He learned the species in Australia. He has been selling trees to Texas ranchers with almost no success. His name is Calvin Marsh, and he is out of a nursery operation west of Yoakum. Before Clara left his office, Dr. Pruitt said one more thing. He said, Mrs. Vance, the question is not whether the trees will help your cattle in a normal year. They will. 3, 4, maybe 5%. The question is what happens in the year the rain doesn't come. That is when you will know whether you built it right. Clara wrote that down too. She drove home through San Antonio and stopped to see her father, who was sitting on his porch in the October afternoon sun. She did not tell him about the visit to Kingsville. She sat with him for 2 hours and drank iced tea and let him talk about the ranch and about Roy and about the property east of La Pryor that Boyd was pushing too hard on the expansion note. When she left, she kissed his cheek and told him she loved him and drove back to Zavala County. That night at the kitchen table, she opened the drawer and took out the notebook. She opened it to the page where Gareth Hollis had stood in a September afternoon in 1961 and told her about the drought of 1958. She read it slowly. She turned the pages. She looked at the numbers. Hollis had kept the records her father had written down in his precise accountant's hand. The cattle weights by year, the grass protein percentages, the percentage of herd lost in the drought year compared to the neighboring ranches. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She was back at the kitchen table at 5 the next morning with a cup of coffee and a new composition notebook and a box of sharp pencils. She spent the winter of 1980 and all of 1981 designing the planting pattern. She was not going to plant in rows. Rows were for timber operations, for windbreaks, for the kind of trees that were meant to be harvested. She was going to plant in a scatter pattern she had seen Hollis use at the Corrientes operation, a pattern that looked random from a distance, but was not random. Minimum spacing of 40 feet between trees. Maximum of 80. Across 4 specific pastures that together totaled 240 acres of the ranch's 340. 400 trees across 240 acres. Less than 2 trees per acre. The pasture would still be a pasture. The grass would still be the dominant surface. The cattle would graze the way they had always grazed. But within 5 to 7 years, if the trees established properly, they would be tall enough and wide canopied enough to cast intermittent shade across the grass during the hottest hours of the longest days. And the roots would be pulling water from depths the grass could not reach. She worked out the geometry on graph paper, each pasture drawn to scale, each tree positioned as a numbered dot, the water troughs marked in blue, the shade patterns projected forward 5 years and 7 years and 10 years, drawn in pencil arcs around each numbered position. She drove over the pastures on weekends and stood in the places where she had marked dots on the paper, and felt the soil through her boots, and looked at the sky and calculated the angle of the afternoon sun in July. She placed the order with Calvin Marsh in February of 1982. She called from the kitchen telephone on a Tuesday evening after she had confirmed by telephone that he would be bringing his trees to the nursery auction in Yoakum in March. She asked about his eucalyptus camaldulensis stock. He asked how many she needed. She told him 400. There was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds. 400, he said. That is correct, Clara said. Another silence. Ma'am, I want to be sure you understand what you are buying. These trees get large. In good conditions, they can reach 40 or 50 feet. They will shade out your grass beneath them. This is not a shade tree for a yard. I understand what I am buying, Clara said. She drove to Yoakum on a Saturday morning in March of 1982. Boyd had called the night before and asked if she needed anything. And she mentioned she was going to the nursery auction, and he said he would ride along. He was like that, Boyd. Showing up whether you wanted him to or not. The way a heavy piece of furniture shows up in a room doing nothing wrong. Exactly, just present and immovable. The auction barn in Yoakum smelled of damp soil and fertilizer sacks, and the particular green humidity of growing things kept in an enclosed space. There were folding tables with seedlings and bulb stock and ornamental shrubs. There were a few ranchers looking at perennial grasses. There were women buying herbs and perennials for kitchen gardens. Calvin Marsh had been there since 6 in the morning. He was 48 years old, a lean man with sun-damaged forearms and the particular look of someone who has spent years doing careful work that nobody notices. He had his trees lined up on 3 folding tables at the back of the barn, 400 saplings in 1-gallon black nursery pots. Eucalyptus camaldulensis propagated from seed stock he had brought back from Australia. In 1968, he had been trying to sell these trees to Texas ranchers for 14 years. By 11 in the morning, not one person had stopped at his tables. A few men had walked past and made comments to each other that Calvin had pretended not to hear. One man picked up a pot, looked at the pale, thin sapling inside it, set it back down, and walked away without saying anything to Calvin directly, which was in some ways worse than if he had. Calvin was standing behind his tables at 11 o'clock that morning, having a private conversation with himself about what he was going to do when he got home. He was going to call his son in Austin and tell him. Then he was going to call the nursery supply company and tell them he would be liquidating his greenhouse inventory. Then he was going to call a realtor in Yoakum and find out what the property was worth. 14 years. There is a limit to what a man keeps trying after 14 years of being told in one way or another that he is wrong. Clara Vance stopped at his table at 11:15. She looked at the trees for a moment. She picked up one of the pots and looked at the root ball visible through the drainage holes at the bottom. She set it back. She looked at Calvin. She asked him 3 questions. She asked whether the stock had been grown from Australian seed or from cuttings. She asked what the root depth was at 12 months in South Texas clay loam. She asked whether he had sold any into working pastures or only into ornamental plantings. Calvin answered all 3. He had grown from seed. The root depth in clay loam was typically 8 to 12 feet at 12 months deeper in sandier subsoil. He had never sold into a working pasture. Clara opened her checkbook. Calvin looked at her. He looked at the checkbook. He said, "Ma'am, I want to be honest with you before you write that check. I don't want your money if you are making a mistake. I have watched people buy plants at auctions for the wrong reasons, and I have watched those plants die. And I would rather take these trees home and try again next year than take your money for something that is going to end badly." Clara folded the check and put it in the pocket of his shirt. She said, "Mr. Marsh, I know what I am doing. I have seen this arrangement work on native grass in a climate hotter than this one. Your trees are coming home with me." Calvin did not argue. He helped her load all 400 pots into the back of the Ford F-250. They fit, barely. Boyd found her at the back tables as the loading was almost finished. He had been wandering the other lots looking at fence posts and a used squeeze chute that one of the ranchers was selling out of the back of a trailer. He came around the end of the building and saw Clara and the truck piled with black nursery pots and the thin, pale saplings sticking up from them like a field of pencils. He stopped. He looked at the pots. He looked at Clara. He looked at Calvin Marsh, who was standing to the side with the expression of a man who has decided not to be involved in whatever is about to happen. Boyd was 56 years old. He had been running cattle in Zavala County since he was 20. He had run his brother's ranch alongside his own for years before Roy could manage it alone. And since Roy died, he had been driving out to the Vance place every Tuesday, driving the perimeter, checking the fence lines, asking Clara what she needed, whether she asked him to or not. He believed in the way that some men believe things they have never examined closely, that his presence on that ranch was necessary, that without him, something would go wrong that he could have prevented. He said, "Maggie, what in the world are you doing?" She said, "Buying trees." He said, "For what?" She said, "For the pastures." He took off his cap. He looked at the saplings again. He said, "You are going to shade out half your grass. You know that." She said, "I know exactly what a tree does to a pasture." He said Roy would have never done this. She looked at him without expression for a moment. Then she said, "Roy is not here to do it, and I am." Boyd looked at Calvin Marsh, who looked back at him with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned not to get involved in conversations between people who share a last name. Boyd put his cap back on. He said, "All right, Maggie." He walked back toward his own truck. He did not say another word about it on the drive home. He drove, and she sat in the passenger seat with the saplings in the bed behind them, and the composition notebook in her purse, and the whole county lying flat and dry and brown in the March light ahead of them. The story was at the feed store in Carrizo Springs by Tuesday morning. The widow Vance had gone to that nursery auction in Yoakum and bought 400 shade trees from some fellow who has been selling them out of a greenhouse west of town. Going to plant every single one of them. Not along the fence line, not near the house, in the middle of the pasture, in the middle of a working cattle pasture on the Vance Ranch. It was at the co-op by Wednesday afternoon. It was at the Dairy Queen by Thursday morning at the corner table where Vernon Holt and 3 other ranchers sat every weekday at 7:30, drinking coffee and talking about weather that was not cooperating and cattle prices that were not improving. Vernon listened to the story the way a man listens to a story he has already decided the ending of. He set down his coffee cup. He said, "She is grieving. That is all this is. Roy has been dead 2 years and she has lost her mind. Going to be a train wreck out there by fall." The 3 men at the table nodded. They had seen this kind of thing before. Widows making decisions they should not make. It was sad in the way that most predictable things are sad. By fall, there would be a different kind of story. By fall, Clara Vance would have 400 dead decorative trees in her cow pasture, and the sensible thing would be to sell the ranch to someone who knew what to do with it. Boyd Vance was not at the Dairy Queen that Thursday morning. He was at his own ranch feeding cattle. But the story reached him before the week was out, and when it did, he said nothing. He did not defend his sister-in-law. He did not tell Vernon Holt or Ray Dutton or anyone else that Clara had always been smarter than she let on, that Roy had said so 100 times, that a woman who had been doing the books and the breeding records and the water management on a South Texas cattle operation for 15 years was not making decisions out of grief. Boyd said nothing, not because he agreed with Vernon Holt. Boyd had driven that ranch for long enough to know that Clara Vance was not a woman who made decisions without reasons. He had watched her manage the finances through 3 bad years in the mid-70s without missing a payment. He had watched her call the vet at 2 in the morning and stand in a muddy lot, working on a difficult calving until it was right. He knew she was not grieving her way into a disaster, but he also knew something else. He knew that whatever she was doing out in that pasture, she had not learned it from Roy. Roy had run cattle the same way his father had run cattle, and the same way his father's father had run cattle before that. Good grass, proper stocking rates, clean water, careful breeding. Nothing that came out of a notebook. Nothing that came out of a library. Nothing that had been sitting in a kitchen drawer for 20 years waiting for Roy to die, so it could come out into the light. Boyd Vance was 56 years old, and he had been the older brother his entire life. He had been the one who knew things. He had been the one Roy called when something went wrong. And now the land that was in his family name was being converted by the woman Roy had married using knowledge that Boyd did not have and could not evaluate and had not been consulted about. He said nothing at the Dairy Queen. He said nothing because saying something would have required him to take a position. And any position he took put him somewhere he did not want to be. Clara planted the first tree on the morning of March 20th, 1982. She had 400 saplings in the back of the F250. She had a post hole digger. She had a shovel. She had a 55-gallon drum of water in the truck bed with a garden hose run through a hole in the side. She had 400 short wooden stakes she had cut in Roy's shop the previous weekend. She had the graph paper map with every numbered position marked. She started in the south pasture first, 120 acres of bluestem and buffalo grass. The pasture closest to the house, the one she could watch from the kitchen window. She paced off the first distance from the fence line, 51 feet. She drove a stake. She dug the first hole. The ground was hard. It had not rained in 11 days, and the top layer of soil was compressed and dry, and the post hole digger did not get through the first 8 inches without her standing on the crossbar with both feet and working it like a lever. The hole took 11 minutes. The sapling went in. She packed the dirt with her boot heel. She ran water from the drum through the hose until the soil around the base was saturated. She tied the stem to the stake with a strip of baling twine. 1 tree planted. 399 to go. She planted 6 trees the first day. She was exhausted before 3 in the afternoon. Her hands were blistered inside her leather gloves, and her shoulders ached from the lever action of the digger. And she stood in the south pasture looking at 6 small wooden stakes and 6 pale saplings, barely visible above the grass line, and understood that at this rate, she would never finish the planting before the summer heat arrived and killed whatever she had put in the ground. That evening, she went into Roy's shop behind the house. Roy's shop was his father's shop before him. Concrete floor, tin roof, a workbench along the east wall built out of creosote-soaked bridge timber. From a railroad trestle that had been torn down in the county in 1949. A post vise bolted to the corner. Tools hung on pegboard in the arrangement Roy had maintained for as long as Clara had known him. Every tool in the same position. Every day, the same way Roy had done everything. She had kept the shop clean since Roy died. She had oiled the tools and swept the floor and kept the lights working. But she had not done much actual work in it. She had hired a man named Luther Gaines from Carrizo Springs to come out on Tuesdays and handle what fence repairs and mechanical work the ranch needed. In the corner of the shop under a canvas tarp was a tractor-mounted post-hole auger that ran off the power takeoff of the Alice Chalmers. Roy had used it for fence work. It had not been run in at least 3 years. Clara pulled the tarp off. She looked at the gearbox. She found Roy's shop manual on the workbench shelf and opened it to the PTO implements section and read it standing in the shop light. The gearbox was frozen. The coupling grease had dried and the shaft would not turn. She worked on it for 4 hours. She used the penetrating oil from the shelf above the workbench. She used the heat gun. She used a pipe wrench and leverage and patience. At 2 in the morning, the shaft broke free. She greased it properly, mounted the auger on the Alice Chalmers, and went to bed. The next morning, she planted 41 trees. 2 weeks later, all 400 were in the ground. She had documented every one of them in a new composition notebook. She had used the fence lines and the water troughs as reference points and drawn each pasture on its own page. Each tree as a numbered dot. Each dot cross-referenced to a line in the ledger where she had recorded the date. Planted the size at planting the species designation and a soil moisture observation at the time of planting. Total cost of the planting operation, $253. 2 weeks of her daylight hours and $253. The county had one word for what she had done: crazy. She had planted 400 decorative trees in the middle of a working cattle pasture. She had done it alone in the March heat with a tractor-mounted auger and a 55-gallon water drum and a notebook that nobody had seen but her. And she had done it for reasons that she had not explained to Boyd or to Vernon Holt or to anyone in Zavala County. She had not explained because explaining was not the point. The point was the work. The point was the trees in the ground and the water in the soil and the years of growth ahead. The point was what Gareth Hollis had shown her in a Corrientes pasture in September of 1961. What her father had written down in his careful hand. What Dr. Wallace Pruitt had confirmed in 6 hours at a desk in Kingsville in October of 1980. The point was the year when the rain would not come. That year was 6 years away. The county did not know it yet. Clara did not know the exact year. But she knew it was coming the way any careful observer of South Texas weather knows that drought is not a question of weather, but a question of when. She had built the insurance policy. Now she had to keep it alive. By the end of May of 1982, 63 of the saplings were dead. Clara had known there would be losses. Dr. Pruitt had told her to expect between 10 and 20% in the first year. She had budgeted for it. She had planned for it. But knowing a number on paper and watching the actual trees turn brown at the tips, and then yellow at the base, and then the particular gray-white of a thing that has stopped trying is a different experience than planning for it. She walked the pastures every morning and marked the dead ones in her notebook with a small X beside the number, and moved on to the next. 63 X marks by the end of May. Then the dry spell came. 23 days without rain beginning in the second week of June. Temperatures above 100 degrees for 19 of those days. The kind of heat that comes off a South Texas pasture in June like something rising from below the surface of the earth, rather than descending from the sky. Clara drove the water drum out twice a week and watered every surviving sapling by hand. She ran the hose from the drum until the soil around each base was saturated, then moved to the next. It took 2 full days each trip. Her hands cracked at the knuckles from the combination of heat and constant contact with the hose fittings. The leather of her gloves dried and stiffened overnight, and she had to work them soft again each morning before she could use them. On the 4th trip, the alternator on the F-25 failed on the way back from the South pasture. She sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off and the heat coming through the windshield and the empty water drum in the bed behind her. Then she got out, walked back to the shop, and spent 3 hours replacing the alternator from a spare she found on the parts shelf above Roy's workbench. The spare was for a 1971 model. The truck was a 1974. Roy had left a note in his parts binder about the modification required. Clara read the note, made the modification, and drove back out to finish the watering. Boyd came out on a Tuesday evening in early July. He had not been to the ranch in 3 weeks. He drove his truck down to the south pasture and got out and walked along the fence line looking at the trees, or at what remained of them. Clara was at the far end of the pasture working on a broken cage. She saw him coming and kept working. He walked up and stood nearby without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "Maggie, half of them are dead. You can see it from the road." She did not look up from the cage wire. She said, "Some are dying. Not half." He said, "Clara." He stopped. He took off his cap and held it in both hands and looked at the trees around them. She could see him working up to something. He said, "I told Frank 20 years ago that his wife was smarter than she let on. I'm saying this to you now because I was his brother, and he would want me to say it. You are running yourself into the ground over some trees from a nursery sale. You have a good ranch. You have good cattle. You do not need to prove anything to anyone. Not to me. Not to Roy. Not to anyone in this county." She looked up at him then. She said, "Boyd, I am not trying to prove anything." He said, "Then what are you doing?" She said, "I am planting trees." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "You are a stubborn woman, Clara." She said, "I am." He put his cap back on. He stood there another moment looking at the pasture and at the dead saplings with their gray-white stems and the living ones with their silver-green leaves catching the late afternoon light. Then he drove away. He did not come back for 5 months. That night, Clara sat at the kitchen table with Eldon's notebook open in front of her and a new composition notebook beside it. The kitchen was quiet. The window above the sink was dark. She could hear the cattle in the south pasture, a low, steady sound that was as much a part of the ranch as the sound of the wind. She picked up a pencil and opened the new notebook to a blank page. She wrote 4 words. Maybe they are right. She sat looking at those words for a long time. Maybe 3 minutes. The kitchen clock moved. The cattle shifted in the pasture. The pencil was still in her hand. Then she drew a single line through the sentence, clean and deliberate. She closed the notebook and went to bed. At 5:30 the next morning, she called Dr. Pruitt at the King Ranch station. She knew it was early. He answered on the 3rd ring and did not sound surprised to hear her voice. She told him about the 63 losses. She told him about the cattle damage and the dry spell and the alternator and the cage failures. She gave him the numbers precisely the way he had given her numbers in his office in Kingsville 18 months before. There was a pause on the line. Then Dr. Pruitt said, "Mrs. Vance Gareth Hollis lost 18% in his first year in Corrientes. You have lost 15.75. You are running ahead of the man who taught you the system." Clara sat with that for a moment. She said, "All right." He said, "Replace the ones you lost in the spring before August. The fall rains will give them establishment time before the winter. Keep the cage repairs current. The cattle will lose interest in the lower leaves once the trees get above their reach." She said, "How long until they are above their reach?" He said, "At current growth rates, about 18 months. Clara thanked him and hung up. She ordered replacements from Calvin Marsh that same week. He delivered them himself. He drove out from Yoakum on a Wednesday afternoon with 71 saplings in the bed of his own truck, wrapped in damp burlap against the heat. He charged her 35 cents each, which was below his cost, and he did not explain why. She did not ask. They unloaded the pots together in the shade of the equipment shed, and she made him a glass of iced tea, and they sat on the tailgate of his truck for a few minutes without talking much. Before he left, Calvin looked out at the pasture where the surviving saplings stood in their cages in the afternoon light. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know, when you walked up to my table in March, I had decided that morning it was the last auction I was going to do. I was going home to sell the greenhouse. Clara looked at him. He said, I want you to know that. I want you to know what you did that morning. Clara said, I bought 400 trees. He said, yes, you did. He drove back to Yoakum and Clara went back to work. Over the winter of 1982 and into the spring of 1983, the trees grew. By March of 1983, they were averaging 4 feet tall. By June, 5 feet, and beginning to put on the accelerated summer growth that eucalyptus does in its second year. Once the root system has established below the competition zone of the pasture grasses, the cattle had stopped working the cages. The lower leaves were now above the reach of all but the largest animals, and the largest animals had better things to do than work that hard for a mouthful of something unfamiliar. Clara kept her records. Twice a year she took forage samples from locations under the tree canopies and from open pasture locations an equal distance from any tree, and she sent them to the Texas A&M Extension Lab in Uvalde for crude protein analysis. The numbers that came back in the fall of 1983 showed the grass under the trees running about 1.5 percentage points higher in crude protein than the open pasture samples. A modest difference. Encouraging. Boyd drove out in the fall of 1983 and looked at the trees from the county road. He did not stop. Clara saw his truck slow as it passed the south pasture and then continue without turning in at the gate. She was in the equipment shed working on the hydraulic line of the Alice Chalmers, and she watched him through the open door. She went back to work on the hydraulic line. That spring, Boyd sent his son Gary out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning without advance notice. Gary was 28 years old, a decent enough young man who had grown up watching his father manage the county the way some men manage a room, which is to say, by assuming that the most important thing happening in it was whatever they were doing. Gary drove up to the house and found Clara at the kitchen table going over her breeding records. He sat down and accepted the coffee she offered, and they talked for a few minutes about the cattle market, which was soft, and about the rainfall, which had been reasonable through the spring. Then Gary set his cup down and said, Aunt Clara, my dad wants to know if you would consider selling the north 80 acres. He said he would pay fair market value. He said it would simplify things for you. Clara looked at him without expression. She said, tell your father that the north 80 is where I am planning the next phase of planting. I will be expanding the tree cover up there in the spring. Gary looked at his coffee cup. She said, is there anything else Boyd wanted me to know? Gary said, no, ma'am. She said, thank you for coming out, Gary. Gary drove back to his father's ranch. Boyd got the message. He did not send Gary again. He did not come himself. 5 years of silence began with that Tuesday morning conversation, and Clara went back to her breeding records, and then to her planting plans, and the north 80 acres was staked and mapped and ready by October. The grass changed. Clara measured it. She had been measuring it since 1983, but the difference became visible to the naked eye in the summer of 1985, when the trees were averaging 15 feet tall, with canopy spreads of 8 to 12 feet. The grass in the shaded zones and in a radius of approximately 15 feet around each tree was a distinctly different shade of green from the open pasture grass. Darker, more saturated. In a hot July afternoon, you could walk across the south pasture and read the location of every tree by the color of the grass beneath it. Even when the tree itself was 100 yards away. Clara took forage samples in the fall of 1985 and sent them to Uvalde. The protein numbers came back 3 to 4 percentage points higher under the trees than in the open pasture. Not 1.5 points, 3 to 4. The difference between adequate and excellent in a hay analysis. In November of 1985, She weighed her calf crop for the first time against the 4-year records she had kept since Roy died. Her steers were averaging 61 pounds heavier at weaning than the previous 4-year average. She sat at the kitchen table with that number for a long time. 61 pounds per head. At market prices in November of 1985, that was approximately $43 per head at the sale barn. Multiply that across her calf crop, and the trees had already returned more than the cost of planting them several times over in their 4th year, before they had reached anything close to their full canopy development. She did not tell anyone. She wrote it in the notebook and made the calculation twice to be sure, and then she went on with the work. The county was busy with other things. Boyd Vance was not in foreclosure. Boyd was not that exposed. But Boyd had bought a new John Deere tractor in 1983 at the persuasion of the dealer in Uvalde, who had offered financing at what seemed at the time a reasonable rate given where rates were heading. The rate was 19%. Boyd was paying $14,200 a year on that note. In 1986, when the price of beef dropped below 60 cents a pound for the 3rd consecutive year, Boyd sold 40 head of his Angus breeding stock to make the payment. Clara sold nothing. Clara had no notes. Clara had a 3-year-old Alice Chalmers that she maintained herself using Roy's shop manuals and the same shelf of spare parts Roy had kept stocked since 1970. And she had no debt and no payments and no dealer in Uvalde calling her in October to discuss the note structure. Nobody in Zavala County was watching carefully enough. In the summer of 1987, a man named Earl Dawson drove out to the Vance Ranch unannounced on a Thursday morning. Dawson was the district livestock and range agent for the Texas Agricultural Extension Service covering 4 counties including Zavala. He was 44 years old, a careful, methodical man who had spent his career trying to get South Texas ranchers to consider management practices they had no interest in considering. He had heard about the trees on the Vance Ranch. He had heard about them for 2 years in various forms from various sources, none of them charitable. Trees in a cattle pasture. The widow Vance and her Argentine shade trees. The place that looked different from every other ranch in the county, and not necessarily in a good way. He had not driven out sooner because he had been busy, and because the information reaching him had not suggested urgency. What finally brought him out in July of 1987 was a piece of paper on his desk. It was a written complaint from a neighboring rancher alleging that the eucalyptus root systems on the Vance property were infiltrating the adjacent soil and drawing down the water table on the complaining party's property, causing measurable damage to pasture productivity. The complaining party was Vernon Holt. Dawson spent 3 hours on the Vance Ranch that Thursday. He walked the pastures systematically. He took soil moisture readings at 32 locations distributed across shaded zones, open zones, fence line zones, and locations adjacent to the fence shared with Holt's property. He took soil samples at 12 of those locations for lab analysis. He measured canopy spread on 20 trees selected at random and recorded their height using a clinometer. Clara walked with him. She answered his questions. She showed him her notebooks, 5 of them now covering 1982 through the current year. She showed him the forage protein data from the Uvalde lab. She showed him the calf weight records. She showed him the planning maps and the original graph paper layout from 1981. Dawson was quiet for most of the walk. He asked precise questions and wrote down precise answers. He was not the kind of man who told you what he was thinking while he was thinking it. At the end of 3 hours standing at the gate of the South Pasture, he looked at his clipboard and then at Clara. He said, "Mrs. Vance, I'm going to tell you what I found before I write the formal response to the complaint, because I think you should know." She said, "All right." He said the soil moisture readings adjacent to your eastern fence line which is the fence shared with the Holt property, are higher than the readings in his open pasture. Not lower. Higher. Your root system is not drawing down the water table on his side of the fence. The deep taproot activity on your side is actually creating a lateral moisture gradient that elevates soil moisture in the top 4 feet of the soil profile along the fence line. Clara said nothing. Dawson said the formal response to the complaint is going to indicate that there is no evidence of damage to adjacent property. In fact, the data suggests the opposite. His grass along that fence line is benefiting from your trees. Clara looked out at the south pasture, where the trees stood in the July heat, their silver-green leaves turning in the dry air, the grass beneath them visibly different from the grass in the open. She said, "Vernon Holt filed the complaint." Dawson said yes. She said, "Will you tell him what you found?" Dawson said, "I will send him the formal report. Whether he reads it carefully is his own business." She thanked him. He drove back to his office in Uvalde to write his report, and Clara went back to the ranch work, and the summer of 1987 moved forward into fall without incident. But something had shifted, not visibly, not in any way that anyone in the county would have noticed or named. Something had shifted in the quality of the certainty that surrounded the question of what Clara Vance was doing out there on County Road 7, with her Argentine trees and her 5 composition notebooks. The certainty had been absolute in 1982. It had been the easy, certain confidence of a consensus that has never been seriously tested. And it was still confident in 1987, still sitting at the corner table of the Dairy Queen every morning, still discussing what would eventually happen when the widow ran out of road. But it was the kind of confidence that has heard something it did not quite understand and has not yet decided whether to acknowledge it. The spring rains in 1987 were adequate. The summer was dry, but not catastrophic. Clara weighed her fall calf crop in November of 1987, and the steers were averaging 94 pounds heavier at weaning than her pre-planting 4-year baseline. 2 years earlier, it had been 61 pounds. The trees were 11 years from seed in some cases, and the south pasture trees were casting canopies of 20 to 25 feet across the grass at midday. She sent the forage samples to the Uvalde lab in October. The crude protein numbers came back in November, 4.5 percentage points above the open pasture samples. The grass under those trees was feeding cattle with the nutritional efficiency of hay that some of her neighbors were paying $12 a bale for in a dry year. Clara recorded the numbers in the notebook. She made the calculation. She set down her pencil and looked at the kitchen wall for a moment. Then she got up and poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the sink, looking out at the south pasture in the November afternoon light, the trees standing in the long golden slant of the low sun, the Brangus cattle grazing at the edges of their shadows. She thought about Gareth Hollis standing at the edge of his Corrientes pasture in September of 1961, with the Parana River in the distance. She thought about her father writing in his neat hand, in a composition notebook at a wooden table somewhere in Argentina. She thought about the kitchen drawer where the notebook had sat for 12 years while she was married to Roy, and the trees were not planted. And the years went by the way years go by on a working ranch. She thought about Dr. Pruitt in his office in Kingsville saying the question is what happens the year the rain doesn't come. The stock tanks in the county were lower than usual, going into the winter of 1987. Clara noted it. She had been watching weather patterns and stock tank levels and grass recovery rates for 5 years with particular attention. The spring of 1987 had been adequate but not generous. The summer had been drier than the 3 preceding years. The winter rain, which typically came in November and December and recharged the shallow aquifer, was slow arriving. She went back to the kitchen table and opened her rainfall log for the previous 10 years and traced the pattern with her finger. The drought years in South Texas do not announce themselves. They arrive the way the worst things arrive, quietly each month, slightly drier than the last each month, within the margin of variation that a rancher can reassure himself is just weather, just a dry spell, just the cycle running a little long this time. By the time the drought is undeniable, it has already been going on for 6 months, and the grass is gone, and the hay is gone, and the water is going. Clara looked at her graphs. She looked at the soil moisture readings from the Dawson visit in July. She looked at her tank levels for the previous 8 months. She looked at the cattle weights and the grass protein numbers and the total carrying capacity calculation she updated every quarter. Then she called Calvin Marsh. She ordered 100 additional trees for spring planting along the north boundary, the last major section of the ranch that did not yet have significant canopy coverage. Calvin said he would have them ready by March. He had been keeping a standing order of Eucalyptus camaldulensis propagated and ready since 1985, because after what Clara had done and what the extension agent's report had said, and what a few careful observers in the county had begun to notice, Calvin had started getting inquiries. Not many, but some. And he had learned to keep stock ready. Clara marked the north boundary planting positions on a new sheet of graph paper and added them to the master map. She made sure her water drum was serviced. She checked the auger gearbox and found a wear pattern developing in the coupling that she replaced before it could fail. She went about the work the way she always went about the work, without announcement, without explanation, without asking anyone whether they thought it was a good idea. The winter of 1987 and 1988 was dry. December brought half the usual rainfall. January was worse. February of 1988 brought a brief rain that raised the tank levels marginally and then stopped. And by March, the pattern was clear to anyone watching it carefully. Clara planted the north boundary trees in March of 1988. 100 of them in 3 weeks of cold mornings that turned hot by noon. She had the auger running smoothly. She had the spacing measured. She had the notebook ready for the documentation. Each tree went in the ground with the same care as the first tree had gone in on the morning of March 20th, 1982, 6 years before. Packed soil, saturated base, wooden stake baling twine tie. She finished the last tree in the second week of April and stood in the north pasture, looking at the small, pale saplings spread across the land, and then turning to look south at the mature trees in the south pasture 30 feet tall. Now their canopies beginning to touch in places the grass beneath them dark and deep. That contrast was the whole story. That contrast was everything. The spring rains in 1988 came light, 2 inches instead of 8. The grass that should have been knee-high by May was ankle-high and already showing stress at the tips. By June, the stock tanks in the county were dropping faster than anyone wanted to say out loud at the Dairy Queen. By July, the word that nobody wanted to use was in the air over every fence line conversation and every co-op visit and every morning coffee table in the county. Drought, the real kind. The kind that does not end in August when the rains are supposed to come back. The kind that keeps going month after month. The sky white and empty in the mornings. The grass shortening and then disappearing, the cattle losing condition in the invisible daily arithmetic of heat. Stress and inadequate forage, and water that is getting harder to reach. Vernon Holt sold 60 head of his Hereford cattle in June. Good breeding stock cows he had been building the herd around for 5 years. He got 48 cents a pound. He needed the cash to pay for the water he was hauling from a neighbor's well, because his own stock tanks were dry. Boyd Vance sold 80 head of Angus in July. 42 cents a pound, less than he had paid for them as calves 3 years earlier. He needed the money to cover the note payment on the John Deere and the hay bills that were coming due from the winter feeding. He had not anticipated needing to extend through June. 3 other ranchers in the county sold early. One of them sold his entire calf crop in July, 2 months, before normal weaning because he could not afford the feed to maintain them. Another offered his grass lease to a land company out of San Antonio and took the deal because his alternative was bankruptcy. A ranching family east of Carrizo Springs that had been on their land since 1923 called a realtor in July of 1988 for the first time. Clara did not sell anything. Earl Dawson had been back twice in the spring, taking measurements, documenting the conditions. He had begun writing a report for the Extension Service. He had also begun making quiet phone calls to his contact at Texas A&M in College Station, describing what he was observing on the Vance Ranch and asking whether anyone at the university had interest. The answer from College Station was yes, but that was coming. The summer of 1988 was not over yet. The drought was not finished. Vernon Holt was still driving past the Vance Ranch fence line every morning on his way to and from the feed store. And on most of those mornings, he did not slow down. But on one particular morning in early August, he slowed down. And then he stopped. And then he got out of his truck and walked to the fence and stood there in the 8 o'clock heat, looking at something he had told everyone in Zavala County for 6 years was going to be a train wreck. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. She was standing at the sink with a coffee cup in her hand, and she saw his truck on the shoulder of the county road, and she saw him standing at the fence, and she set her coffee cup on the counter and stood there watching him. He stood at the fence for the better part of an hour. She stood at the window for the better part of an hour. He did not look toward the house. He looked at the trees. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the grass. He looked at the ground. Once he reached through the fence wire and pressed his hand flat against the soil in the shaded zone beneath the nearest tree, the way a man checks whether something is real, whether the thing in front of him is actually there. Then he walked back to his truck. He opened the door. He got in. He started the engine. He drove away. Clara picked up her coffee cup. She looked at the south pasture for a moment longer. Then she finished her coffee and went out to check the water troughs. The drought of 1988 did not break in August. It did not break in September. The sky stayed white and hard through October, and the cattle across Zavala County continued their slow arithmetic of loss, each week a little lighter, each week a little less able to walk the distance between the water and whatever remained of the grass. The men at the corner table of the Dairy Queen in Carrizo Springs talked about it, the way they talked about everything that could not be changed, which is to say with a specific kind of resignation that sounds like analysis but is actually just the voice of a country learning to absorb a fact it cannot alter. 3 weeks after Vernon Holt stood at Clara's fence line and drove away without speaking, a truck turned onto the county road and pulled up to the Vance Ranch gate on a Tuesday morning in late August. It was not Vernon's truck. It was a younger man's truck, a clean late-model pickup driven by a young man named Danny Holt, who was 22 years old and Vernon's grandson through his oldest son. Clara was in the equipment shed working on the belt drive of the Alice Chalmers when she heard the truck. She came to the shed door and saw Danny standing at the gate, cap in hand, looking toward the house. She walked out to meet him. Danny was a straightforward young man, which was to his credit. He did not waste time on a long approach. He said, "Mrs. Vance, my grandfather sent me. He is not going to say it himself, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. He has been driving past your ranch for 6 years, and he has some things he would like to understand, and he is too proud to come ask you himself. So he sent me." Clara looked at him. She said, "Come inside." She brought him to the kitchen table and poured him a glass of water, which in August of 1988 in South Texas was worth more than coffee, and she sat down across from him. Danny asked his grandfather's questions as though they were his own, which showed a certain grace. He asked about the trees, which species and from where. He asked about the spacing and the planting depth and the soil preparation. He asked about the water troughs and whether the cattle behavior had changed under the canopy. He asked about the grass recovery time after grazing in the shaded zones versus the open. Clara answered every question. She went and got the notebooks, 4 of them, and laid them on the table, and walked Danny through the records. The planting dates, the species documentation, the soil moisture readings from Earl Dawson's 1987 visit, the forage protein analysis from the Uvalde lab, the calf weight records year by year from 1983 through 1987. Danny sat with those numbers for a while. He was young, but he understood numbers. He had grown up on a ranch, and he knew what a 94-pound weight advantage at weaning meant in dollars at the sale barn. Clara showed him the graph paper maps of each pasture, with the tree positions marked the spacing logic. The shade angle projections she had drawn in pencil in 1981. She showed him the composition notebook her father had written in Argentina in 1961. The original records from Gareth Hollis's ranch in Corrientes, the drought year of 1958, and the percentage losses on both sides of the comparison. Danny sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. He asked good questions and listened to the answers and wrote some things in a small notebook he had brought. Before he left, he said, "Mrs. Vance, I want to ask you something that my grandfather did not send me to ask." He said, "Why are you showing me all of this?" Clara said, "Because the knowledge is not mine. It came from a man in Argentina who got it from reading papers from Australia and Spain. It came from my father who wrote it down for me. It came from a researcher in Kingsville who spent an afternoon making sure I understood it correctly. It came from 21 years of a notebook sitting in a kitchen drawer waiting for the right year. I did not invent any of it. I just planted the trees." Danny nodded. He said, "My grandfather is going to lose the ranch if the drought goes another year. You know that." Clara said, "I know." Danny said, "Would you let him come out here himself?" Clara said, "The gate is never locked, Danny. It has never been locked." Danny drove back to his grandfather's ranch. Clara went back to the equipment shed and finished the belt drive on the Alice Chalmers. Vernon Holt did not come that week. He did not come the following week. The drought continued through September, and the stock tanks across the county dropped to levels that nobody had seen since the 1950s. And the word bankruptcy moved from the back of conversations to the front. 2 ranches in the county went to the bank in September. A 3rd family put their land on the market in October, rather than wait. Vernon came on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of October. He drove up to the house and knocked on the front door, which nobody who knew Clara used. She came around from the side of the house where she had been cleaning a water trough and found him standing on the front porch with his hat in both hands like a man appearing before a judge. He was 61 years old. He was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, the kind of man who had always filled a room without trying. But standing on that porch, he looked smaller than he was. Or rather, he looked correctly sized for the first time, which, after 6 years of occupying more space than the facts warranted, was its own kind of adjustment. He said Clara, just her name, nothing after it. She said, "Come around to the kitchen, Vernon." She made coffee, They sat at the same table where she had sat with Danny 3 weeks earlier, and the notebooks were still on the shelf nearby, and the kitchen was quiet in the October morning with the windows open and the first cool air of the fall moving through the screens. Vernon did not ask questions the way Danny had asked questions. Vernon sat with his coffee and looked at the table for a while. And when he spoke like a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say enough times that he has worn all the elaboration off it and is left with just the plain material underneath. He said, "I sat at the Dairy Queen in the spring of 1982, and I told Ray Dutton and Carl Wicker and Harlan Forbes that you had lost your mind. I said you were grieving and it was going to be a train wreck by fall. I said it more than once. I said it for 3 years." Clara drank her coffee. "He said I was wrong about you. She said it is all right, Vernon. He said it is not all right. But I appreciate you saying it." They sat for a moment with that. Then Clara stood up and said, "Let me show you the pastures." They walked the south pasture first, the oldest, planting the trees that were 6 years in the ground and 30 feet tall with canopies that overlapped in places and threw a broken, dappled light across the grass that was still alive in late October, when the surrounding county had nothing but dirt and stubble. The cattle moved around them as they walked unhurried the way cattle move in a pasture where everything is working right. Vernon walked slowly. He looked at the ground under the trees, which was darker than the open ground, which held the particular quality of a live soil that you can see in the color and the texture when you know what you are looking at. He stopped at one tree and crouched down and pressed his hand flat against the ground, the way he had pressed it through the fence wire in August, as though he needed to confirm again that the moisture was real. He stood up. He said, "How deep are the roots?" Clara said the tap roots are between 20 and 30 feet in the mature trees. The lateral root network runs from the surface down to about 8 feet in a radius of roughly 15 feet around each trunk. He said that is why the grass holds. She said the roots bring the water up from below the drought line. The canopy keeps the surface temperature low enough that the grass does not burn. The leaf litter breaks down into the soil and builds the organic matter which holds more water than bare clay. All 3 things working together. Vernon nodded. He looked across the pasture at the trees standing in the October light, their silver-green leaves moving in the dry air. He said, "I have been running cattle on my land for 40 years. Clara said nothing. He said, "I did not know this was possible." She said neither did anyone else in the county. That was the point. The knowledge existed. It just had not been applied here. They walked for another 2 hours. Clara showed him the calf weight records in the field, pointing to locations in the pasture and telling him what the grass protein numbers had been at each point in each year. She showed him the water trough usage patterns. She had tracked the reduction in the number of trips the cattle made to water in the summer months as they shifted to early morning and late evening grazing under the canopy. She showed him the soil probe she used and demonstrated how to read it. Vernon asked good questions. He had been ranching long enough that he understood immediately what the implications of each thing were. He did not need her to explain why a 4-point protein advantage in summer forage mattered. He did not need her to explain the arithmetic of 94 extra pounds at weaning. He had been doing that arithmetic his whole life. He was just doing it now against a different set of inputs. At the end of the walk, standing at the gate of the south pasture, Vernon said, "Danny told me you showed him everything. Every notebook." Clara said yes. He said, "Why would you do that for me? After what I said about you." Clara looked at the pasture for a moment. Then she said, "Vernon, the knowledge is not a weapon. It is not something I am keeping to prove a point. My father got it from a man in Argentina who got it from somewhere else. Gareth Hollis gave it to my father freely. My father wrote it down so I could have it. Dr. Pruitt gave me his afternoon. The whole chain of this thing is people giving it away. I am not going to be the one who stops the chain because someone sat at the Dairy Queen and said the wrong thing in 1982. Vernon was quiet for a moment. He said, "You are a remarkable woman, Clara." She said, "I planted 400 trees and kept records. That is what I did." He said, "That is not all you did." She said, "It is enough." Vernon Holt ordered 300 trees from Calvin Marsh the following week. He started the planting process that winter with Earl Dawson's help. And by the spring of 1989, he was putting trees in the ground on his 640 acres. But the larger wave was still building. Earl Dawson had filed his formal report in September of 1988. The report documented the soil moisture differentials, the forage protein data, the calf weight records, and the drought performance comparison in specific quantitative terms. He had sent copies to his superiors in Austin and to his contact at Texas A&M in College Station, a soil scientist named Dr. Karen Whitmore, who had been working on grass and soil systems in arid environments for 12 years. Dr. Whitmore called Clara in early September. She asked if she could bring a team out. Clara said yes. 6 researchers came in late September, 2 days on the ranch taking soil cores at 40 locations, collecting forage samples, photographing every pasture, measuring every tree, conducting a systematic survey of the canopy coverage and grass distribution that took both days to complete. They were careful and methodical, and they did not say much about what they were finding while they were finding it. Clara fed them lunch on both days and answered their questions and showed them the notebooks and the original maps and the Argentine records from Gareth Hollis. And on the evening of the second day, Dr. Whitmore sat at the kitchen table and told Clara what she thought they had. She said, "What you have built here is the most thoroughly documented silvopasture system in the state of Texas, possibly in the American Southwest. You have 6 years of continuous records on soil moisture forage, quality cattle performance, and drought resilience from a working commercial operation. There is no comparable data set in the literature. Clara said the records are in those notebooks. They are yours to use if they are useful." Dr. Whitmore said, "We would like to open a formal research program based on this ranch. We would like to write a paper about what you have done here. We would like to put your name on it." Clara said, "You can use the data. You do not need my name on the paper. I am a cattle rancher, not a scientist." Dr. Whitmore said, "Mrs. Vance, you did this work with more scientific rigor than half the papers I have reviewed in the last 10 years. Clara said, "Then you know how to write it up properly without me. Put me in the acknowledgments. Cooperating producer. That is enough." The article Helen Pryor wrote for the San Antonio Express News ran on the 4th of September, 1988, on the front page of the business section. The headline read, "In the drought's worst summer one, Zavala County rancher still has green grass." Under the headline was a photograph of Clara standing at the edge of the south pasture with 3 of her Brangus steers visible in the middle distance, and the 30-foot eucalyptus trees rising behind them into a clear South Texas sky. The telephone started ringing the day the article ran. Clara answered some of the calls. The ones from ranchers in other counties who wanted to come see the trees she let come. She walked them through the pastures. She showed them the notebooks. She answered their questions. She charged nothing and asked for nothing. Between September of 1988 and March of 1989, 112 ranches from 14 Texas counties sent someone to the Vance Ranch to walk the pastures and ask questions and look at the trees. Calvin Marsh had more orders than he could fill by October of 1988. He called Clara in November to tell her, and she told him to hire someone to help him propagate. He called again in February of 1989 to say he had hired 2 people and was still behind on orders. He called a third time in March when he made his 20,000th sapling sale, which was more trees than he had sold in all 14 preceding years combined. That third call was different from the others. Calvin called in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and when Clara answered, he did not speak for a moment. She could hear him on the line, just the sound of him holding the phone. And then he said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. He said, "I came to Texas in 1968 with the seed stock and the propagation knowledge and the intention of building something. I spent 14 years building it and watching it sit there being built with nobody wanting it. I had made up my mind on the morning of that auction in Yoakum. I was standing behind those tables at 11 o'clock, and I had decided that was the last time. I was going home and selling the greenhouse, and I was done." Clara said, "I know Calvin. He said you walked up to my table at 11:15. You bought 400 trees from a man who had already quit. You kept something alive that was 7 minutes from being over. The same way you kept those trees alive through your first summer, when half the county said they were dead." He paused. He said, "I've been thinking about how to say this for 6 months. I do not have better words than that. You kept something alive that almost died the day you walked up to my table. And I wanted you to know that I know it." Clara said, "Calvin, you kept it alive for 14 years before I got there. I just showed up before you stopped." He said, "That is a generous way to put it." She said, "It is the accurate way to put it. We kept each other going. That is what the good systems do." Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have a waiting list of 4 months. I am propagating 7 days a week. I am going to need more greenhouse space." She said, "Then build more greenhouse space, Calvin." He said he would. He did. Boyd came out on a Saturday morning in October of 1988. 5 years of silence ended by the sound of his truck on the gravel drive on a clear October morning, when the heat had finally broken and the first real fall air was moving through the county. Clara was in the south pasture repairing a crossbrace on a fence section that the cattle had been working on. She saw his truck come through the gate and park near the house, and she watched him get out and look toward the pasture. And then she went on working on the fence. He walked out to where she was. He had his cap in his hands. He was 62 years old now, and he looked at the weight of the bad years showing in his face, in the particular way that debt and drought and pride, all working against a man, at the same time leave their mark. He stood nearby for a moment looking at the trees around them. The trees were 6.5 years old in that pasture, 30 feet tall. Their canopies threw pools of shade across the October grass, and the cattle moved through that shade with the ease of animals that have learned the landscape of their pasture, the way a person learns a house. Boyd had not been in this pasture since before the planting. He had not seen what it had become. He stood and looked for a long time. Then he said, "Roy would have loved this." Clara said he would have Boyd. Boyd said, "I was wrong about you." She said, "It is all right." He said, "It is not all right. But I appreciate you saying it." They stood in the October morning with that between them, and the trees stood around them. And somewhere in the south part of the pasture, 3 Brangus steers were moving slowly from shade to grass and back again. Then Boyd said, "Can I walk the pastures with you?" She said, "You do not have to ask." They walked for 3 hours. Clara showed him everything she had shown Vernon, everything she had shown Danny, everything she had shown the researchers from Texas A&M. The spacing logic, the soil moisture, the grass protein numbers, the calf weights, the drought performance. She showed him the cross-reference notebooks, the planting maps, the original graph paper from 1981. Boyd asked good questions. He had always understood cattle and land. He had just never understood this. They were moving through the South Pasture when Boyd stopped at a particular tree, number 47 on the master map, a tree near the middle of the pasture that was one of the largest on the property. Its trunk now 8 inches in diameter, and its canopy spreading 25 feet in every direction. Boyd stood under that tree and looked up through the canopy at the October sky visible through the leaves. He said Roy used to call this piece of ground the wet patch. Said it held water different from the rest of the pasture. Said he could always find the cattle here after a rain because the grass came back faster. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the notebook she was carrying to the planting page for the South Pasture. She found the entry for tree 47. She read it. She said, "I noted highest soil moisture at planting for this location, higher than any of the surrounding positions." Boyd looked at her. She said Roy was right about this patch of ground. He read it correctly every time he walked it. He just did not know why. Boyd looked at the tree. He looked at the dark grass around its base. The grass that was still alive and protein-rich in October of 1988, when the surrounding county had bare dirt. He looked at the sky through the canopy. He said if he had lived. She said yes. Boyd stood under tree 47 for a while longer. Then they walked on. At the end of the walk, standing at the gate of the South Pasture, where she had stood with Vernon Holt and Earl Dawson and Danny and the researchers from College Station, and 112 ranchers from 14 counties. Boyd said, "How many can I get from Calvin Marsh?" She said, "As many as you want. I will call him Monday." She put her hand on his arm for a moment, just briefly. Then she said, "Welcome back, Boyd." He said, "I'm sorry I was gone so long." She said, "You are here now." He drove home and she went back to the fence repair in the South Pasture, and the October afternoon went on, around her the trees standing in the low-angle light. The cattle grazing easy, the county outside the fence doing the slow work of deciding whether this year was the year it finally understood what she had been building. It became the most cited paper on temperate silvopasture in the United States for the following 15 years. Researchers in Arizona and New Mexico and Oklahoma used it. Extension agents across the southern states used it to make the case for tree integration in cattle systems. It changed over the course of a decade and without anyone announcing that it was changing the way a generation of range scientists and progressive ranchers thought about what a pasture was supposed to look like. Clara did not attend any conferences. She did not give lectures. When the Texas Cattlemen's Association offered her a speaking slot at their annual meeting in 1990, she declined politely. When a reporter from a Houston paper called in 1991, wanting to write a longer profile, she said she appreciated the interest but had cattle to tend to. She ran the Vance Ranch for 16 more years after the drought of 1988. The drought of 1998 hit Zavala County hard. It was not as long as 1988, but it was more intense in its peak months, and the ranchers who had not spent the intervening decade rebuilding their management systems felt it the way the 1988 ranchers had felt that drought. Clara lost 3% of her herd. The county average that year was 21%. Earl Dawson called her in September of 1998 to tell her the numbers, and she thanked him and asked how his family was doing and went back to checking the water troughs. In the fall of 2003, the son of Vernon Holt drove out to the Vance Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon. Vernon had died in August at the age of 76. A good death at home after a good long illness that had given everyone time to say what needed saying. His son Thomas was 51, a careful man who had taken over the ranch from his father in 1995. and had been running it with the trees his father had planted in 1989, standing now 20 feet tall across the best pastures. Thomas sat at Clara's kitchen table and drank coffee and told her about his father's last months and the things Vernon had said near the end about the county and the work and the years. Then he reached into his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper and put it on the table in front of Clara. She looked at him. He said, "My father wanted you to have this after he was gone. He said you probably did not know about it. He said he should have told you a long time ago, but he was too proud. And by the time he was not too proud anymore, it seemed like too much to explain." Clara unfolded the paper. It was a photocopy of a document, a cover page with the heading Zavala County Agricultural Extension Service Silvo Pasture Initiative Proposal, January 1991. She looked at the first page. Then she turned to the second page. In the upper right corner of the second page, in the margin in a handwriting she recognized as Vernon Holt's from the time she had seen him sign documents at the co-op, was a sentence written in blue ink, based on observations made at the Vance Ranch, August 1988. Clara sat with the paper for a while. Thomas said he stood up in front of the county board that January and proposed the initiative. He did not say your name in the speech. He was still working on his pride in those days. But he put it in the paperwork. He said he needed it to be in the record somewhere. He said it would not be honest otherwise. Clara looked at the handwriting in the margin. August 1988. The morning Vernon had stood at her fence for an hour in the heat without knocking on the door. The morning she had watched him from the kitchen window without going out to meet him. Two people on opposite sides of a fence in the worst drought in 40 years, both of them in the process of understanding something, each in their own way. She said Vernon was a good man, Thomas. Thomas said he was. He got better as he got older, which is not true of everyone. She said it is true of the ones who are paying attention. Thomas stood to go, and Clara walked him to his truck, and they shook hands in the October afternoon. She stood in the drive and watched him go, and then she walked back to the house and put the photocopy in the drawer of the kitchen desk where she kept important documents. She sat at the kitchen table for a while. She thought about Vernon standing at the fence in August of 1988. She thought about Danny Holt sitting across from her with a notebook asking his grandfather's questions. She thought about Boyd standing under tree 47, saying Roy always called this the wet patch. She thought about Calvin Marsh on the phone in March of 1989, with the sound of a man who had been carrying something for months and had finally put it down. She thought about her father writing in a notebook in Argentina in 1961, sitting at some table somewhere in Corrientes, while Gareth Hollis talked about the drought of 1958 and the insurance policy of trees. She thought about the drawer, the notebook in the drawer for 12 years while she was married to Roy, the drawer she had not opened for 12 years, and then had not been able to stop thinking about the morning after the funeral. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in drawers and waits. It waits for the person who is ready to use it, or it waits for the circumstances that make using it the only sensible option, or it waits for both at the same time, which is the luckiest combination, and the one that had found Clara Vance in the winter of 1980. The knowledge had been there. She had been there. Roy's death had removed the last thing standing between the knowledge and the land. She did not think about Roy's death as a blessing. It was not a blessing. It was the worst thing that had happened to her. And she missed him with a completeness that did not diminish in the years after 1980. But she understood that some things only become possible at the intersection of sorrow and necessity, and that the trees were one of those things. She went to the shelf and took down the oldest notebook. the one her father had written in Corrientes in 1961. She sat at the table and opened it and read the familiar handwriting, the careful accountant's script that Eldon Voss had used his whole life. The records from Gareth Hollis's ranch, the drought year comparison. The sentence at the bottom of the third page that she had read so many times the page had developed a slight softness at that point from the touching. Trees in a pasture are an insurance policy against the years when everything else fails. She closed the notebook. She put it back on the shelf. In the spring of 2004, Clara Vance was 62 years old. She had been running the Vance Ranch alone for 24 years. The cattle were healthy. The land was productive. The trees were mature across 660 acres of the 340-acre ranch that had grown over the years through careful purchase of adjacent parcels when the price was right and the debt was zero. The notebooks on the kitchen shelf numbered 11. She had been thinking for several years about who would take the ranch. She had one person in mind. She had been thinking about that person since 1998. Nora had a son named Owen, who was 4 years old in 2004, and who had spent every summer of his short life on the ranch, in the way that children who grow up partly on working land grow up differently from children who do not, absorbing things through the soles of their feet and the palms of their hands that cannot be taught in any other way. Clara transferred the ranch operations to Nora in the fall of 2004. She built a smaller house on the east side of the property, a practical house with a good kitchen and a window that looked west across the south pasture toward the eucalyptus trees, which were now 22 years old and 40 feet tall, and more definitively themselves than anything else on the landscape. She kept the Alice Chalmers. She kept the original notebook her father had written in Corrientes in 1961. She moved both to the smaller house, the tractor to the shed, and the notebook to the kitchen drawer. The same drawer configuration it had always lived in, the same relationship to the kitchen table and the window, and the morning coffee. The years that followed were the years of proof accumulating past the point where proof was necessary. The drought of 2011 was the worst in Texas recorded history. It lasted from October of 2010 through August of 2011 and cost the state cattle industry an estimated number that the newspapers reported, and then revised upward, and then revised upward again. Zavala County lost cattle the way all of South Texas lost cattle in 2011, but the Vance Ranch under Nora's management, running the same silvopasture system Clara had built, and the additional plantings Nora had added in 2006 and 2008, lost 4% of its herd. Clara heard about the 2011 numbers from Earl Dawson, who was long retired by then, but who still drove out to the ranch twice a year to drink coffee and look at the trees and talk about what the data showed. He called in September of 2011 and told her the county figures, and then told her the Vance Ranch figures, and there was a silence on the line while both of them sat with the comparison. Clara said, "How is Nora managing?" Dawson said, "Nora is managing the way you managed, which is to say, well and without much comment." Clara said, "Good." In 2024, the South pasture trees were 42 years old. The trees do not know any of this. They are just trees doing what trees do, drawing water and light and converting them into the structure of themselves and releasing what they cannot use back into the system around them. The knowledge of what they were doing was always in the system. It just took a 19-year-old girl in Argentina in 1961 to see it and write it down, and a widow in Zavala County 21 years later to put it in the ground. Owen Voss was 15 years old in the spring of 2024. He was a serious boy, quiet in the way of people who are genuinely interested in things rather than interested in appearing interested. And he had grown up on the Vance Ranch in the way that Clara had always hoped someone would grow up on it. Knowing every pasture by name and knowing every tree in the South Pasture by its number on the master map, and knowing because his mother had taught him the reasoning behind every spacing decision and every species choice and every year of records in the 11 notebooks on the kitchen shelf. On a Tuesday morning in April of 2024, Nora Voss walked her son out to the equipment shed and opened the door, and they stood in front of the Alice Chalmers tractor, which was 61 years old and had been maintained by Clara and then by Nora, with the same careful attention to the parts shelf and the shop manuals and the principle that a tool properly maintained does not need to be replaced. Owen climbed up to the seat. Nora handed him the starting sequence from memory, the same sequence Clara had spoken aloud on the day she first showed Nora how to start it. The same sequence Roy had used on the day he first started it in 1963. Owen worked the choke and the throttle and turned the key. The engine caught on the second crank. The particular sound of the Alice Chalmers diesel settling into its working idle filled the equipment shed, a sound that had been filling that shed for 61 years, a sound that Clara could hear from the smaller house on the east side of the property, with the window open on a still morning. Owen drove out of the shed and across the yard and through the gate of the South Pasture and out into the morning between the 42-year-old trees. He was 15 years old, the same age Clara had been when she stepped off a plane in Buenos Aires and rode with her father to a ranch in Corrientes province and met a man named Gareth Hollis and heard for the first time about the drought of 1958 and the insurance policy of trees. Nora stood at the gate and watched her son drive into the South Pasture. The trees stood around him in the April morning light, their silver-green leaves turning in the light wind, their canopies throwing the broken shade across the grass that had been keeping this particular piece of land alive through the dry years since 1988. She said quietly to no one in particular, or perhaps to the trees themselves, "Trees in a pasture are an insurance policy against the years when everything else fails." Gareth Hollis had said it to Eldon Voss in Corrientes in 1961. Eldon had said it to Clara in a San Antonio backyard in 1963. Clara had said it to Nora standing in the South Pasture in 1996. Nora was saying it now in April of 2024, watching her son drive the Alice Chalmers between trees that were older than she was. 4 people, 4 generations, 1 sentence, 1 insurance policy, 1 ranch that had stayed green through 3 droughts and 62 years because a 19-year-old girl had paid attention in Argentina in 1961 and written it down. Clara Vance was 82 years old in the spring of 2024. She was living in the smaller house on the east side of the property, with the window that looked west across the South Pasture. And she was as sharp as she had ever been, which is to say, very sharp indeed. She still walked the pastures twice a week slowly now, with a stick on the uneven ground. But she still walked them. She still pressed her hand against the soil under the trees to feel the moisture. She still noted what she observed in a notebook that she kept on the kitchen table. The original notebook her father had written in Argentina in 1961 was in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer it had lived in for 63 years. Owen had the key to it, which is to say he knew where it was, and he knew what was in it, and he knew why it mattered, which is the only key that counts. On the shelf above the drawer were 11 notebooks covering 42 years of records on 340 acres of South Texas land. Soil moisture readings, forage protein percentages, calf weights, rainfall logs, tree growth measurements, the complete empirical record of what happens when a woman plants 400 trees in a cattle pasture while the whole county is laughing. What do you see when you look at a eucalyptus tree in a Texas pasture? Most people see something out of place, something decorative, something that belongs in a different landscape, a different context, a different story than the one being told on a working South Texas ranch. Vernon Holt saw a grieving widow planting Argentine shade trees in a cow pasture. He saw it from the corner table of the Dairy Queen and from the shoulder of the county road and from 30 years of knowing how a ranch was supposed to look. And he was very certain about what he saw. Boyd Vance saw a threat. He saw the land that bore his family name being altered by a woman who had come into the family from outside it, using knowledge that had not come from within it, making decisions that no one had asked her to make. Calvin Marsh saw a sale he almost refused to make. He saw a woman buying trees from a man who had already quit, and he saw it 7 minutes before the quitting would have been final. Clara Vance saw 400 saplings from Corrientes that she had been carrying in a composition notebook since she was 19 years old. She saw a soil survey that matched a piece of land 6,000 miles away. She saw her father's voice telling her in 1963 that Texas ranchers do not plant trees, and she heard underneath it the question he had not asked out loud, which was whether his daughter would. Then the drought came, and Vernon stood at the fence in silence, and Boyd stood under tree 47 and said, "Roy always knew this ground was different." And Calvin called on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "You kept something alive that almost died the day you walked up to my table." And the researchers from Texas A&M took their soil cores and wrote their paper and cited her notebooks 47 times. And 112 ranches walked her pastures and went home and planted trees. And the county that had laughed for 6 years learned the difference between what a thing looks like and what a thing is. 400 saplings, a widow, a composition notebook from 1961. The trees nobody wanted in the hands of the woman nobody took seriously until the drought came, and the whole county saw what had grown in 6 years on Texas grass, and understood too late to have been part of it from the beginning, and just in time to learn from it going forward, that the most consequential things a careful person does are almost always invisible to the room until the moment they are not. And by then, the only thing left to do is stand at the fence and look, and try to understand how you missed it, and drive home and plant some trees.